today I was asked to preach on Isaiah 53. So just to kind of help get us settled in, I guess, can we head up to the next slide? So a couple of things I wanted us to do. Also another piece of context. Is that just training and that's all I want. But two objectives. The second thing is, it sounds really simple, but I want to activate it. It's talking about so also just to help contextualize. And the underlying message behind that is that all the the way I kind of saw this, put it a little bit more positive. This is so that's the first one. Perhaps if your partner maybe or for what cause can you imagine yourself dying for? So I'll give you guys like maybe 10 seconds to think about it, and then just to get up, migrate, walk around, and chat for a little bit while I kind of like take some 10 minutes think time. 10 seconds think time, not 10 minutes. I don't have that much. All right. And it sounds like people are ready, so go ahead, get up and start chatting a little bit.
There's a cry in my heart for your glory to fall, for your presence to fill up my senses. There's a yearning again.
Best that you can in about 15 seconds. Let's try to wrap it up. In about 5 seconds. In 3. In 2, if you could start finishing up and move back our eyes back forward again. In 1, you have about 1 second to appreciate the really cute picture up there. And let's come back together. Can I get a couple of people just to share out like what are some of the thoughts and responses we had from that? I heard a couple of good like share outs. What do we got? Family, okay, your teacher, yeah. What? Yeah. But yes. So family, our teachers. As a teacher, I appreciate that a lot. Thank you. What else? Way to misinterpret. What else? Anyone else we can think of? Like we could give up our lives for? Freedom. Yeah, people do that all the time. Yeah. My favorite movie was Braveheart. That final scene, like where you know the scene I'm talking about, right? Yeah. Freedom. Yeah, it gets me every time. It's one of two movies I cry in. That's one of them at that exact scene. Anything? It's a Chinese movie it's about a kid who's a human, but that's beside the point. Yeah. There you go. Okay. So our teachers, the freedom or something like worthwhile cause like freedom, right? Or like our family members, the people we care deeply about, people that we love and care about. Can I hit up the next slide? This was not part of the passage that was read because I wanted us to be able to zero in and focus in on it. This actually happened just before verse 4, which is what Kathy started. But it says this, and this is Jesus. This is, by the way, context. Isaiah is, again, a prophet back in about 700 years before Jesus. This is 400. A few hundred years before Jesus, and basically gave a lot of prophecies about concerning this God-man Jesus. And so this word he, at this point, is talking about Jesus. So Jesus, he had no form or majesty that we should look at him, no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. This doesn't look good for Christians or humanity in general. What this says is essentially Christ was not very good looking. I don't think he was ugly, but he had nothing outwardly about him that should make us desire him, or the people of his time to desire him. Right? That there was no draw, there was no magic, there was no trick that he plays to try and, no charisma to draw people to him. All he had was the fact that he was the Son of God, and that was what drew people. Can I hit the next slide? And I think nowhere does this really make its point clearer than in this picture here. What you have on the left side is Palm Sunday, and I think a lot of you guys are familiar with this from Easter. It's when Jesus came into the city of Jerusalem, and along the way people were cheering for him, cutting down palm branches and putting down his feet, giving him the royal reception, because they were under the impression that he was going to heal their sick and going to free them from Roman oppression. Fast forward a few nights later, at his trial, the exact same people, the exact same crowd, when they realized that this man was not going to free them from Roman rule, turns on him, spits on him, and sentences him to death. That's how quickly things turn. There's nothing innately about him that made people desire him. What they wanted was what he could do for them. Right? If we skip to the next slide, please. What this comes down to is this, and Paul put it really beautifully. You see at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. That's us. That's them. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, or teachers, or your family members, or freedom. Very rarely. That could happen. People do give up their lives for things like that. Though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrated his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, while we were still God's enemy, Christ died for us. Let that sink in a little bit. Let it permeate. That God, Jesus, gave up his life for people Next slide. So here's what happened. He was pierced for our transgressions. This is back to Isaiah again. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And so this is actually, and I was just sitting here this morning and kind of thinking about this and how, this is, and I'm looking outside at the rain and thinking how depressing the sermon sounded. And really, what I want us to focus on, and I promise I'll get us back there towards the end, but I want us to focus on, like, not so much the piercing, not so much on the chastisement, but on the peace. Right? Not so much on the pain and the suffering, but on the joy that it brought and the joy that it brings forward to us. And so that's where I want us to land. And so if you feel a little bit like, oh, what a bummer sermon, stay tuned, we'll pick things up a little bit. But just like, if I can skip forward another slide or two. So, so a couple of quick things. I just realized, just skip forward to the next slide. I don't want to do this. So the next part is this. So then we continue reading on to, I'm going to skip a little bit, jump down to verse 10. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. And when his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his day, and the will of the Lord shall prosper in his hands. So when I read this, like I struggled a little bit, and this is another kind of teacher move. But when you're reading this passage, you notice all the he's and hims, and they're not all referring to the same person. So if I can get the next slide, I'll give you guys kind of a little bit of help here. Hopefully this is helpful. Again, teacher. Yet it was, so hopefully this is helpful. So the blue is going to be the Father, the red part's going to be the Son, as near as I can interpret it. Yet it was the Father's will to crush the Son. The Father has put him to grief. And when the Son's soul makes an offering for guilt, the Son shall see the Son's offspring. The Father shall prolong the Son's days, and the will of the Father shall prosper in the Son's hand. Take a moment, chat again with neighbors about just things that you notice or things that questions you might have. And I do like questions. Like there's so many questions that can come out of this. And let's talk a little bit after about, let's say 30 seconds. I'll give you guys 30 seconds to just chat a little bit more. Cindy? Any questions you might have about this passage? Anything you notice that's out of the ordinary? Anything that seems strange? Yeah, got it. Okay. In about 10 seconds, we'll continue. In 3, in 2, and 1. Oh, I have hella time. Okay, I didn't have to rush. All right. In 1, if I can get us to come back together again, can I get like maybe just like 3 questions kind of shared out, things that we noticed? Zach, between you and David, did you guys have anything or? Okay, cool. We'll come back to you later. How about Leon and which part? The whole thing. Like, can you point to one specific part that you didn't understand? No clue where to start. Okay. Okay. How about you, Candy? Not sure? All right. All right. Let's see. Let's try a volunteer this time. Like, anyone have any like questions or thoughts or wonderings? Go ahead, David. Yeah. He shall prolong his days. Yeah. Like, what the hell does that mean? Okay, cool. The way I see it is God will grant him eternal life. That's the way I'm reading it. Yeah. And I'm answering it now because this wasn't one of the things I was planning to talk about, but this is precisely why I'm doing this, because there's a lot here, and I'm only going to unpack one part of it. So, yeah, what's up? He shall see his offspring. This is especially weird in that you might have remembered, but earlier on in the passage, it actually says, like, who shall speak of his descendants? He didn't get to live. Like, and it's weird because now it's saying, like, oh, he shall see his offsprings. And I think this has something to do with the fact that we are all now considered the children of God by his work on the cross. And so he gets spiritual children by the act of going through the cross. So, yes. And he gets to see it happen, which means he doesn't stay dead. Because you can't see things if you're dead. Was there another one, or did you take that first one? Yeah, that's good. Was there any closing ones? I give you guys 5 seconds before we continue. 2, 1. Okay, next slide, please. So this passage gives us 2 problems. One, the first is this, like, did the Father God force his will onto his Son? Right, that's the first troubling thing that I ran across. And number 2, did the Father actually cause the crucifixion to happen? And that's we get into trouble there a little bit, so I want to unpack both of them. Let's start with the first one. Hit up the next slide for me, please. The cross was not divine child abuse. Right? Because it started off with, like, it was the will of the Lord to crush him. Let's put it a little bit more differently. The King James Version, I like this. Get this. The King James Version decides to translate it this way. The Lord's Prayer, not the Lord's Prayer, when Jesus was praying in the garden, he prayed this, like, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. Now, this does kind of 2 things for me. One, it says it really separates the Son from the Father a little bit, in that they both have their decisions and their wills, right? The Father wants something, the Son wants something too. The Son clearly, if possible, does not want to bear that cup. The Son did not, just because he's a human being, humans don't want to die. The Son did not want the cross. That part of him did not want the cross. The physical part of him did not want the cross. Right? And there's the other part where it says that, Father, if there is no other way, I will do this. Right? So it does that 2 things for me. One, it separates the Father's will from the Son's will, and it's distinct. Because if it was not distinct, if they were the same, if they were one entity, there wouldn't be this inner conflict, right? But there was that inner conflict, and Jesus the Son had to decide, does he submit to the Father's will or not, and he decides to do so. Right? And the second part here, the next one, comes from, again, John 10. And I realized there was a lot of passages I could have picked from. I kind of deliberately chose ones that were Jesus' direct quotations, because this is Jesus' own words. Right? The reason my Father loves me is that I laid down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down. the authority to take it up. I lay it down of my own accord. This was not something forced on Jesus. He had the authority to say no, right? If he has the authority to lay it down, by reason, he should have the authority to not lay it down as well. He had the choice to do so. He wouldn't have that authority. He wouldn't say he has authority if he had no choice in the matter, right? I firmly believe on the cross, he had the option of getting out of there. He always had that choice, but he chose to stay, and he chose to went through with the will of the Father. That's important. That's so important. Right? And we'll talk about why it's important in just a little second. But can we hit up the next slide? The next part kind of troubles me. Like, remember I said those two things that bothers me. One was like, is this divine child abuse? The second was like the fact that this was God's idea. And the fact that this was God's idea doesn't sound like so what. Here's the so what. This was history's greatest collection of sins. Take a look at this. Like, which one do you think is the worst? Like the fact that the guy who whipped Jesus, the guy who betrayed Jesus, many guys who condemned Jesus, the crowds that mocked him, the soldiers that nailed him, Peter who left him and like abandoned Christ, the soldier who speared Jesus, or Pontius Pilate for washing his hands through all of this. Like, which one is the greatest sin? Where do you start? There's no greater collection of evil, like, ever in the history of humanity, in the history of creation. Like, the worst evil you can imagine, and this tops that. And it was the will of the Lord. That should bother us a little bit. Right? Can I hit the next slide, please? This was God's idea. It was the will of the Lord to crush him. And again, King James Version, it pleased the Lord to crush him. Now, this opens up a can of worms, because if God willed all of the evils that led to the cross, where does that put us with the evils that are going on today? Right? Pastor Joseph started off our first two sermons in this series with the idea of like war, how it's ongoing and still happening now. And with just violence like the shootings in San Bernardino and all these tragedies that happens all around us all the time, and how the gospel promises joy and peace through all of it. Right? We get to struggle with the question of like, did God will those two? Right? And I don't have a solid answer for that question. Well, no, I take that back. I don't want to dig into the answer too much. My answer is yes, I think you could. I don't want to unpack that too much. What I will unpack for us is that God had a hand in the evils that took place that led to the cross. He could have stopped it. He could have stopped the nailing. He could have stopped the condemning. He could have stopped the whipping. He could have stopped all of it. And he chose not to. Right? The Old Testament had a story about a king named Abimelech who almost slept with Abraham's wife. And he didn't, because God stopped him. And he told him so the next day. Abimelech didn't even know God. He wasn't even a Jew. God has the power to stop, change, and alter the course of history so that evils don't happen. And in the case of the cross, did not. Now, this is the point, I think, where a lot of Christians start getting into like, well, God didn't cause these tragedies to happen. He just kind of allowed it. Or he just uses these things. And I struggle with that perspective, because it almost feels like we're trying to get God off the hook a little bit. Like, oh no, evil happened, God, but then we keep saying God is in control, and yet this thing happened. What do we do? And maybe God just using it. Maybe like, you know. So God doesn't need that defense. He straight up said it. Like, it was the will of the Lord to crush Son Jesus. That happened on his order. Now, if we can't accept that, if we can't accept the fact that God can somehow ordain evil, can somehow have evil take place under his watch, can somehow plan out evil. This was planned. This was 400, 700 years before this happened. This was planned. Right? This was not last minute. It was planned. If we can't accept the fact that God can mean evil, will evil, plan evil to take place, and yet somehow like have good purpose for all of that, if we can't accept that, God can do all of that and still somehow remain holy. If we can't accept that, you have no gospel. You have no gospel. Because the gospel is that in the spearing, in the nailing, in the whipping, in the betraying, in the abandoning, in the scoffing, in the washing of the hands, in all of that, this was him loving you. And if you take that away from him, if you don't give him the authority to will the crushing of Christ, to will the evils that led up to that, the cross was a historical accident. It was an innocent man that got killed unjustly. It's a tragic story, but it's not the gospel. It's not the gospel. Right? And so there's a lot at stake in this, in understanding that the will of the Lord was to crush him, that this was God's plan to love you, so that 2,000 years ago, a boy was born into this world, and we'll hear about it next week. And that the boy was born from before he was born, there was a plan in place already for him to live a certain life a certain way, and to die a certain death. To the glory of us all and to the glory of the Father, so that we can be his children, so that we can be the offspring that when Jesus rises, he gets to see. And I hate the fact that it's taken us such a bummer mood, but it's not meant to be a bummer mood. This is meant to be a cause for celebration. And I'm not skilled enough to kind of turn the mood around from get it a little bit more celebratory. But guys, this was good news. This is God loving us. And I want us to kind of leave with that, with the idea that through all of this, that through this horrible, horrible, horrible series of sins, and through all horrible series of sins and sufferings and evil, that God has a beautiful plan that involves you, eternity, and Jesus. Thank you. Father, it feels strange, God, going into Christmas the week before about your death. This feels more like Easter. But Lord, it's all one part. I love the fact that the Old Testament verifies what happens in the New. I love the fact that you died for us when we did not love you. And that for a brief moment in history, Lord, you suffered. And you suffered alone. You suffered without the Father there. But you did it for us. Lord, you loved us so much. Help us love you back again in a way that you deserve. Help us just understand and desire. And so when tragedies happen in our lives, we do not blame you. We do not say, Lord, that you were not in control in that moment. But Lord, we trust, Lord, that you had a divine purpose. Because God, if you can take the worst sins and the worst sufferings and the worst evil in history and mean it for good, God, how much more what we're going through in this life? How much more can you do, Lord, with cancer and with wars and with just sufferings, God? And so, Lord, give us the faith to trust in you more deeply. Give us the love to desire you more deeply. And Lord, it's